He was no longer young. The lean, dangerous kid who shook the world was gone. In his place stood a king in a white jumpsuit covered in jewels, a king in a golden cage called Las Vegas. The crowd still came. They screamed his name. They threw things on stage. To them, he was still a god. But the man inside the suit was tired. He was heavy. His eyes, once full of fire, now held a deep sadness. He was living a life that was happening to him, not one he was choosing. And in the middle of this spectacle, this nightly ritual of past glory, he found a song. A song that wasn't his. A song he transformed. It became his truth. It became the story of his final, lonely years. The song wasn't born in America. It started in France. It was about something much smaller than a legend's final act. It was about a love affair ending. It was about the slow death of a relationship, the daily grind that wears two people down. The original French song spoke of routine, getting up, going to work, pretending to be happy, going to bed. The title meant as usual. It was a song of quiet desperation, the kind millions of people feel every day. It had a pretty melody, but its heart was sad and mundane. It was a sigh, not a roar. There was no defiance in it. There was just acceptance of the slow, inevitable end. It was popular in Europe, a familiar tune on the radio, but it wasn't an anthem. It was just a song about a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday. Then an American songwriter heard it. A young, successful man named Paul Anka. He bought the rights to the melody. He knew the original lyrics wouldn't work for an American audience. The quiet desperation needed to be replaced with something else. He thought of Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was older then. He was thinking about maybe retiring. He was a man who had lived a huge life. He had seen it all, done it all. Anka sat down and wrote new words. He wrote them in the first person. He imagined Sinatra at the end of his career, looking back. The new lyrics were not about a dying love affair. They were about a life lived without compromise. The song became a statement. A boast, almost. It talked about facing the final curtain. It talked about regrets, but having too few to mention. The core of the song was one powerful line, a declaration of independence. It was a man saying he took the blows, he stood tall, and he did it his way. When Sinatra sang it, it was perfect. His voice was full of swagger and confidence. It was the sound of a man with no doubts. It was a victory lap. The song became his signature tune. It was the anthem of the self-made man. The guy who came from nothing, broke all the rules, and won. It was a song for a winner, sung by a winner. It was triumphant. It sounded like a man raising a glass of whiskey in a quiet bar at 3 a.m., smiling to himself. He knew he'd won the game. The world tried to beat him, but he beat it first. The song was a statement of power and control. It was about a life lived on one's own terms, from start to finish. There was no sadness in it. There was only pride. It was a closing statement, but from a man who was closing the book himself on his own schedule. Elvis Presley heard the song. By this point, in the early 1970s, he was deep into his Las Vegas phase. His life was a routine, just like the original French song. The same city, the same hotel, the same show night after night. He was surrounded by people, but he was profoundly alone. He was the boss, he was the king. But he was also a prisoner. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, controlled his career. His entourage controlled his daily life. His fans' expectations controlled his image. He was trapped inside the legend he had created. He couldn't just walk down the street. He couldn't go to a movie. He lived in a penthouse suite, high above the world, but it was a jail cell with a better view. He was getting divorced from his wife Priscilla. He was losing control of his health, his diet, his body. He was starting to rely heavily on prescription drugs to sleep, to wake up, to perform. He was a man adrift. He decided to add the song to his show. At first, it might have just been another big ballad to please the crowd. But something happened when he sang it. It was not the same song Sinatra sang. Coming from Elvis, the words changed their meaning entirely. It was no longer a boast. It was something else. A justification, maybe. A desperate plea to be understood. When he sang about facing the final curtain, it didn't sound like a man in control looking back with a smile. It sounded like a man who could see the end coming, and he was scared. He wasn't closing the book himself, he felt the book closing on him. The pride in Sinatra's version was replaced by a deep, heartbreaking vulnerability. His performance of the song was pure theater. It would start quietly, just him and the microphone. The orchestra was soft. He would sing the opening lines in a low, thoughtful voice. He looked like he was confessing something to the audience. He was telling them his story. He sang about eating it up and spitting it out, and you could see the cost of that life etched on his face. The sweat on his brow wasn't just from the stage lights. It was the sweat of a man working hard to hold himself together. Then, As the song built, his voice would get stronger. The orchestra would swell behind him. He wasn't just singing the words anymore, he was living them. He was acting them out. He'd strike a pose, a flash of the old karate moves. He would clench his fist. He would point to the crowd or up to the heavens. The climax of the song was an explosion. His voice would soar, full of power and pain. He would belt out the final lines. He was a man trying to convince himself as much as the audience. He was telling the world, and maybe God, that he had lived with integrity. That even in his gilded cage, he had maintained some core of himself. But it didn't sound triumphant. It sounded tragic. It was the roar of a wounded lion. It was a man standing in the ruins of his life, proclaiming that he had been the architect. But the foundation was crumbling. Everyone could see it. When he finished, he would stand there breathing heavily, drenched in sweat. The cape of his jumpsuit spread wide like an angel's wings. Or maybe the wings of a fallen angel. The crowd would erupt. They loved it. They felt the emotion. They felt the struggle. They probably didn't understand the depth of his pain, but they knew they were witnessing something real. In 1973, he performed the song for the whole world. The Aloha from Hawaii concert was broadcast by satellite. 1 billion people watched. He was at the peak of his global fame. He was dressed in a white American Eagle jumpsuit, a symbol of his own patriotism and mythic status. He looked beautiful, tanned, handsome, powerful. He seemed to be on top of the world. He sang the song that night, and to the world it must have seemed like a confirmation of his greatness. Here was the biggest star on the planet singing his personal anthem, a song of a man who did it all his own way. It looked like a victory, but it was the beginning of the end. The performance was flawless, but it was a mask. Behind the scenes, the pressure was immense. The cracks were already starting to show. The years that followed were a slow, public decline. The tours continued. He got heavier. His movements on stage became slower, more deliberate. Sometimes his speech was slurred. There were shows where he could barely get through the songs. The band would have to cover for him. His eyes, once so alive, were often glassy and unfocused. He would ramble between songs, talking about strange things, paranoid thoughts. It was painful to watch for those who knew him, but the crowds kept coming. They still saw the king, and he still sang the song. In his final years, the performance became even more raw. It was no longer a show. It was a battle. He was a man, fighting his own body, his own demons, right there on stage. He would pour every last ounce of his energy into that one song. It was often the closing number. It was his final statement of the night, and it felt like his final statement on life. The defiance in the lyrics was now laced with an unbearable sadness. When he sang of having regrets, you believed him. You felt that he did have them, more than a few. The line about taking the blows felt literal. Here was a man who had taken every blow life and fame could throw at him, and he was still standing. Barely. The powerful voice was still there, but it was strained. It was the sound of a man holding on by a thread. Just weeks before he died, in the summer of 1977, a TV special was filmed. It was called Elvis in Concert. The footage is almost impossible to watch now. He was bloated, sick, and exhausted. He was a ghost of his former self, a shell of the beautiful man he had been. He looked decades older than his 42 years. He sat at the piano to perform a different song, and his voice was thick with emotion. But he also stood center stage and sang his anthem one last time for the cameras. He was wearing a gaudy, ornate jumpsuit. He was sweating profusely. He had to read the lyrics from a sheet of paper held by a backup singer. He, the man who had sung this song hundreds of times, couldn't remember the words, but he sang it. He summoned the strength from somewhere deep inside. His voice cracked. He struggled to hit the high notes, but he got through it. The performance was not good in a technical sense. It was a wreck, but it was one of the most honest things he ever did. In that final televised performance, the song's transformation was complete. It was no longer a French song about a boring marriage. It was no longer Sinatra's ode to a life of cool confidence. It was a man's last will and testament. It was a confession. It was a cry for help. It was a desperate claim of dignity from a man who had lost control of everything. And he sang that he did it his way, but what did that mean anymore? His way had led him here. To this stage, under these hot lights, barely able to stand, his body failing him, his mind clouded by drugs and despair. It was the ultimate tragedy. He was singing about his freedom and his choices, but he had never been less free. He was a prisoner of his own myth, and the song was the anthem of his beautiful, tragic, lonely prison. When he died, the song was released as a single. It became a massive hit all over again. It was played on every radio station. It was his unofficial eulogy. It cemented the image of the tragic late-period Elvis in the public mind. The song became inseparable from his death. It became the soundtrack to his decline. People heard it, and they pictured the man in the white jumpsuit, sweating, struggling, but singing his heart out. They pictured a lonely king in his castle, dying too young. The song became an epitaph. It told a story that was both true and false. He did do many things his way. He changed music, he changed culture, he broke down barriers, he was a true original. But in the end, his life was not his own. The forces around him and the demons within him were too strong. The song gave him a way to frame his own tragedy. It allowed him to present his suffering as a choice, as a noble sacrifice. It was a way of saying, don't pity me. I chose this path, I lived by my own rules. It was a powerful illusion for him and for his audience. It was the final piece of the myth. The song allowed him to be a tragic hero, not just a victim, and that is why it became the symbol of his final years. It captured the paradox of his life, the immense power and the crippling weakness, the global adoration and the profound isolation, the triumphant image and the devastating reality. It was a mask he wore until the very end. A beautiful, powerful, heartbreaking mask. The song was My Way.